We're up over 50 and people will keep ticking in. So welcome. It's really, really great to have all of you here. And it's really wonderful to celebrate Professor Jeff Pugh's book, The Invisibility Bargain. My name is Stacy Vanderveer. I am chair of the Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance. Very excitedly for all of us, Jeff's book is out and looking wonderful. Also exciting is that the subtitle of The Invisibility Bargain is Governance Networks and Migrant Human Security. So he has covered a substantial amount of our department's very long name in the title of his book. Jeff is assistant professor in our department at the McCormick Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies. He is also founding executive director of the Center for Mediation, Peace, and Resolution of Conflict in Quito, Ecuador. He has a long, now many years relationship with his deep interests and love of all things Latin America and Ecuador in particular. And we're just thrilled with this book. For those of you who are students, you should know that he started his collegiate career at the University of Georgia. I am fairly certain he's still a reasonably proud Bulldog these years later. And then he went on to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore for a master's and a PhD in political science, focusing his dissertation work on the beginnings and some chunks of what is now this wonderful book. Let's see, Stephen McAveen, who is a graduate student in our Global Governance and Human Security doctoral program, I believe is going to help with this event. And Stephen, I think I turned things over to you, is that correct? For a brief video, and then we'll go to Jeff to talk to us a little bit about the origins and the content of his book.
Thank you very much, Stacy. I'm going to share this video, and as all went well on our test run, I think it should be fine. Of the estimated 272 million international migrants in the world, nearly half are living outside of Europe and North America. Migrants fleeing economic hardship or violence are entitled to a range of protections and rights under domestic and international law, yet they are often denied such protections in practice. In an era of mass migration and restrictive responses, migrant acceptance is often conditional on the expectation that they contribute economically to the host country while remaining politically and socially invisible. These unwritten expectations, which Jeffrey D. Pugh calls the invisibility bargain, produce a precarious status in which migrants' visible differences or overt political demands on the state may be met with hostile backlash from the host society. In this context, governance networks of state and non-state actors form an institutional web that can provide indirect access to rights, resources, and protection, but simultaneously help migrants avoid negative backlash against visible political activism.
I'm Jeff Pugh, a professor at UMass Boston, and my new book, The Invisibility Bargain, Governance Networks and Migrant Human Security, published by Oxford University Press, seeks to understand how migrants negotiate their place in receiving societies and adapt innovative strategies to integrate, participate, and access protection. Specifically, I examine Ecuador, the largest recipient of refugees in Latin America over the past 2 decades, and I assess how it achieved migrant human security gains despite weak state presence in peripheral areas outside of the capital cities. I draw on evidence from 15 months of fieldwork that I did spanning 10 years in Ecuador, including 170 interviews, an original survey of Colombian migrants in 6 provinces, network analysis and discourse analysis of hundreds of presidential speeches and news media articles. I argue that places with more dense networks composed of more diverse actors tend to produce greater human security for migrants and their neighbors. The book challenges the conventional understanding of migration and security, providing a new approach to the negotiation of authority between state and society. By examining the informal pathways to human security, I show the connections between international and national politics, and I unpack the micropolitics of institutional innovation.
The Invisibility Bargain is the winner of the Arthur P. Whitaker Prize for Best Book from the Middle Atlantic Council of Latin American Studies. Elizabeth Cohen of Syracuse University says the Invisibility Bargain is absolutely critical research for anyone working in contemporary migration studies. Gioconda Herrera, president of the Latin American Studies Association and professor at Flaxo, Ecuador, calls it the most comprehensive analysis of Colombian forced migration in Ecuador to date. Lauren Landau of Oxford University says, this text is destined to become a reference for discussions of governance and mobility for years to come. The Invisibility Bargain is available at bookstores or directly from Oxford University Press, and you can learn more online at invisibilitybargain.com. We invite you to check it out. Well, thank you very much for watching our video. I hope that you enjoyed it. And I think I will pass it over to Jeff now.
Thank you, Steve. It's always nice to have backup so I don't have to think about all of those technical parts as we're moving forward. So I appreciate that. And what a wonderful turnout. What a wonderful group here that is both a bit nostalgic, seeing folks going back quite a ways that I've known in some cases for many years, and others who occupy a treasured space on my citation lists and are frequently referenced, and others are our colleagues and students now and in the past. We have folks who were interns with Simproc, my NGO, at different points. So, and we have family. So all of those are certainly important folks in my life and are part of the support network, since we focus so much on networks, that produced this book. So what I want to do today is actually not give a traditional kind of full research talk, but because this is supposed to be a party, it sort of, but we have folks who know more or less about the book. So I will still talk about the book and at least want to walk you through the main arguments, and probably won't spend as much time on the evidence. You're welcome to go look at the book for that. I instead will share a few stories that sort of illustrate some of the examples of these mechanisms playing out. Before I do that, though, I wanted to trace a little bit of about the origin story, where this came from, and how I came to this project. As I think most of you know, my name's Jeff Pugh. I'm a professor in the Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance department here at UMass Boston. And I guess I would trace back to my undergrad days. As Stacy mentioned, I was at the University of Georgia, which is where I grew up, and I was a foundation fellow, which gave me wonderful opportunities to travel a lot. Like every spring break and every summer, there were travel opportunities. One of those summers, I wanted to do some independent research. And so I went to the director of Latin American Studies at the time at the university and asked for some suggestions. And he was Ecuadorian and had some contacts and friends that he was able to set me up with. And so that summer, after my sophomore year, I spent doing research on watershed politics, of all things, in Ecuador, and just really fell in love with the country. Was thrilled with the diversity in terms of culture, in terms of geography, everything in just a very small country. And so when I graduated, I went to a symposium in Monterrey, Mexico, that brought together peace builders and conflict resolution people from all over the world, all over Latin America especially. And going through that and seeing the ways that people were engaged in practice at the ground level was inspirational for me. And so that was sort of one of those turning points where I decided that I wanted to contribute as a practitioner at that time. And so I decided to return to where I had friends and contacts and relationships in Ecuador, and found a new organization, the Center for Mediation, Peace, and Resolution of Conflict. And SIMPROC, as it's known, got its start that year. Afterwards, I went and lived in Ecuador, and that also was a transformational experience. I was developing a training curriculum on conflict resolution skills, and was doing some of those trainings, but also my experience living in a country other than my own put me in a different position than I had ever been before. And I started to digest a bit what it meant when other people look at you and see foreignness, otherness, and they have particular meanings attached to that. In my case, most of the meanings that they had attached to those ideas they had about what it meant to be a foreigner in Ecuador didn't harm me. They weren't mostly negative. For some people, they are. And so that began a process of thinking. And as I became aware that Ecuador was a major receiving country of migrants and refugees, as you heard in the video, Ecuador for the past 20 years has been the leading country for refugees, recipient of refugees in Latin America. That I think is starting to change now as Venezuelans have a larger dissemination pattern. But at the time, Ecuador was the largest recipient, the vast majority of whom were Colombians. And so in 2015, in a June week, I partnered with a volunteer from the Peace Corps, with the municipal government of Ibarra, Ecuador, a town sort of near the northern border, the UN High Commission on Refugees, and UNIFEM, and some others, to carry out a training for and dialogue series for Colombian and Ecuadorian women. And during that week, it really helped me to understand the ways that stigma and stereotypes develop, the way structural problems can impede coexistence and peace among migrants in their host communities. And so that's when I decided to really go back to grad school and to have this be the project that I would work on. And I've since graduating and leaving my dissertation behind, I've accumulated much more empirical evidence. As you saw in the video, more than 600 surveys with the help of the Fulbright, which I'm so grateful to. And then 170 interviews and a number of other pieces of data. So I want to share a little bit about the kind of main arguments of the book. So let's see if I can share this. Okay. So the core concept that I've developed for the book is this idea of the invisibility bargain. And what I observed, both in my time in Ecuador, growing up in the south of the United States, where there was a large Hispanic migrant population in Georgia, as well as when I did fieldwork in South Africa and was learning about the relations of Zimbabweans and others coming into South Africa, I noticed a pattern that it was not the case that xenophobia and sort of suspicion meant that most people in the country just wanted migrants out altogether. In fact, there were large constituencies within the country that wanted migrants to come in, even when there were conflicts around migration. But it was under specific rules, expectations. These rules and expectations were not written. They were informal, but they were very widely understood and heavily enforced. So the idea is the toleration of the physical presence of migrants was there as long as the host population perceived that migrants were making a contribution that usually meant an economic contribution, but as Michael Sullivan and others have pointed out, it could also mean military service, it could mean important skills that were missing, et cetera. And that migrants are perceived to be socially and politically invisible. So the idea is there's a sort of logic of gratitude that that migrants are expected to be so thankful that they're even allowed to be here, that they have to not be their full selves in public spaces, right? So the hijab ban in France, the Muslim headscarf ban is an example where someone who is Muslim is expected not to be overt in her expression of that belief in public spaces because that would violate the norms of the host community. And so that's what I mean by social visibility. And then political invisibility, meaning that they're expected, again, the logic of gratitude to not rock the boat, to be so glad that they're here that they are not making overt demands on the government, including overt and visible demands for their rights, which they may have guaranteed to them in the formal law. But by going out and protesting for them or making sort of overt demands on the government, they're perceived to not be in their place, right? And so what happens is people are welcomed into the country, but in a very precarious situation. And so there is a gap between formal security protections that are in the law and in institutions and what actually happens in practice. Part of this is that our standard assumption is that the state is the primary security provider in a country for everyone who lives there. But in fact, in a democracy like the United States, like Ecuador and elsewhere, the state is responsive and has political incentives to be responsive to those who vote. And overall, at least in the case of Ecuador, most migrants don't. And so in some cases, the state may actually have a political incentive to scapegoat migrants, to blame them for the problems that are there in order to divert attention from themselves, right? So they face electoral pressure to not be perceived as caring more about foreigners than they do about native-born citizens. So there's this gap that emerges between maybe protections that exist on the books, but the state doesn't necessarily have all the political incentives to enforce them. So in those gaps, we see often an emergence of non-state actors. This could be, in the case of Ecuador, the Catholic Church was a major one. The UN High Commission on Refugees and the UN system was another one. NGOs, non-governmental organizations dedicated to human rights, to a range of things are others, and including informal networks, migrant associations, family groups, neighborhood clubs, etc. And these actors form a sort of loose web of governance, of protection, of connection. And often they become brokers, intermediaries. They help migrants access rights, resources, and protection that they might need. And these non-state actors within the host community can advocate for those things without sort of sparking a backlash. Whereas if migrants themselves go out and advocate for those things and demand them, it can result in kind of a backlash that makes it worse. And so as a result of this indirect pathway to protection, there overall is greater human security and less backlash, or at least the potential for it. So when I talk about peace building, human security, this is sort of an easy shorthand for how to operationalize that. We're talking about rights, peace, recognition, resources, and protection. This already came into the video, so I won't spend a long time on it, but I, unlike some people, didn't go for one long period of time and then go home and write a book. There are pros and cons with that. It took me a really long time to write this and to do the research, and sometimes that didn't feel great. But on the other hand, it gives me a lot of temporal scope that I think snapshot studies miss. The fact that I would go every summer and interview some people, talk to some people. My surveys I did by city. And so in 2013, I did surveys in Quito, the capital city, Ibarra, and Tulcan, or excuse me, Ibarra, sorry, it was Quito, Lago Agrio, and Esmeraldas. And then in 2014, I did in Ibarra, and then in 2015 in Tulcan and Santo Domingo. And so I was able to see change over time that was really helpful, and to see how it differed across space. The fact that I could look at and compare these 6 different provinces. As I mentioned, Ecuador is the largest recipient of refugees and asylum seekers in Latin America, but it has been very uneven over time. And I think it's important to think about what that means. So this graph sort of maps out the 3 periods that I talk about in the book. The first 7 years or so, when lots of Colombians were coming from 2000 to about 2007, the state didn't have much capacity to deal with that incoming flow. I call that the absence period. So in that period, the church actually was one of the leading actors receiving refugees. They were already the institutional authority in a lot of parts of the borders. And then from about 2007 to 2011, the UN High Commission on Refugees coordinated very closely with the state. And this was kind of the high mark for refugee protections in Ecuador. I call this the coordination period, and especially this part right here, the spiky part in the middle, was the enhanced registration. When UNHCR and the Ecuadorian government coordinated, they realized that lots of people weren't coming to Quito to ask for refugee status. They were remaining in the shadows in the border regions or elsewhere because they either didn't know what to do or where to go. Quito is a long way from the border. And so that's a daunting journey when you first come to a country. They, in many cases, feared the government and were afraid to come. And then sometimes they couldn't afford it because the process lasted so long and you weren't actually supposed to work while you were doing it. So during that period, the government and the UNHCR took the registration process to them. They were mobile brigades that they launched and took 50-person groups into various towns in the border region. And what used to be a 6-month process, they compressed into a day. During that 1 year, they doubled the number of registered refugees in Ecuador. So that was a wonderful step forward on the one hand for protection, and Ecuador became sort of internationally recognized for this. I think, though, on the other hand, it raised the visibility of the refugee issue so much that it sparked some of this backlash that I'm talking about with political invisibility. And as the elections of 2013 approached, the president began to backtrack a bit and actually put forth a decree that drastically reduced refugee acceptance rates and made it harder to come in. And I don't know if you can see this dashed line in the middle. That's the acceptance rate, the percentage of those who ask for refugee status who actually get it. And between 2014 and 17, less than 5% of people were awarded refugee status. So this was basically stripped out as an option for most people. During this period that I call regression, the state was the leading actor. It was very important to them to show that the state was in control, that they were leading, but they were shifting from a focus on refugees to a focus on mobility and migration. So not emphasizing the part of protection. These are a couple of quotes of what it felt like, what it looked like to deal with social invisibility. I talked to a Colombian woman in Quito who said, "I stopped selling empanadas, which is a type of pastry, in the streets because I'm afraid. The migration police would often come by, and if they hear a Colombian accent, they would ask to see our documents. The photocopy of my asylum seeker document that I carry serves very little use. They often claim that these documents are fake and detain Colombians anyway. When I go out, I try to keep my mouth shut. So it's not a question of whether someone is legal or not. They still face this kind of social and political invisibility expectation regardless. The political invisibility expectation you can see in this quote from a local government official in the coast. He said, Colombians have started getting involved in politics because they're smart and well prepared. Not too long ago, one even ran for prefect of Esmeraldas, despite being in this country for only 5 years or so. I think they're ungrateful, coming to our country, being welcomed, and then taking over. We as Ecuadorians are the ones who have the right to decide how we will be governed. Another example of political visibility that did in fact result in a backlash. There was a group of mostly Afro-Colombian asylum seekers who were hoping to get third country resettlement. They still feared for their life, even in Ecuador. They thought that people from the FARC or from the paramilitaries had a presence and would know that they were here. And so they were asking UNHCR for resettlement to another country. And they decided to do this by camping out, literally establishing a camp in front of the UNHCR building and protesting and demanding resettlement. One of them said in a news clip, we know they're looking for a way to remove us because we're here peacefully, because we're nonviolent. And I understand that they're even accusing us of being narco traffickers and guerrillas. So we're trying the strategy of staying here. They knew that engaging in politics left them vulnerable and open to charges of, terrorism or stirring up trouble in general. But they were still trying this strategy. Ultimately, it didn't work. The police came in and, as you see in the pictures here, completely surround the area, put all of the stuff in a truck and take it away, and all of the people removed from the area. And the press coverage was not particularly favorable of this. A different kind of example that I think I'll close with was actually in the establishment of a new constitution. Rafael Correa was the president who actually ushered in the idea of universal citizenship, of open borders, and at least had a discourse of very progressive policies towards migrants and refugees. And under his administration, Ecuador rewrote its constitution in a constituent assembly. Before that happened, there was a immigrant organization of Colombians who met together with a small legal aid clinic, an Ecuadorian nonprofit organization run by a young woman in her 20s who had a lot of enthusiasm, not a lot of budget. It wasn't a big organization, but she met with them, and together they developed some recommendations, some sort of best practices in international law, saying if you really wanted to embed protections for migrants and refugees in the Constitution, this is what it would look like. Then, with a small funding from another NGO, they brought Colombian association representatives from different parts of the country, had a one-day training, and then with her contacts, with this director's contacts, she was actually friends with the secretary of the president of the Constituent Assembly. She was able to broker a space. They agreed to let her and 3 or 4 representatives from these refugee organizations come to the Constituent Assembly, present both their brief, their recommendations, and tell their stories. Those stories opened up the door. They humanized what it meant to be a refugee. The Constituent Assembly members were able to hear that and then match that with the technical recommendations in a way that they probably wouldn't have if the refugees themselves just came straight to them, or if they sent them the recommendations without that meeting, which was made possible through these kind of brokered networks. In my book, I actually put side by side the text that they presented in that list of recommendations with the text of the Constitution as it ultimately came out. And it's pretty similar. That was a persuasive political coalition building that worked much better than the protest in the street because it relied on governance networks. It relied on the connections and informal pathways in ways that didn't trigger a violation of the political invisibility expectation. So I think I'll stop there. As I said, there's tons more evidence that you can look at, but I actually, because we have a good crowd here, I would be much more interested in responding to what some of the ideas that folks have here. Let me stop sharing here and check and see if,
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. I do see Professor Herrera. Thank you for joining us.
For inviting me.
Professor Gilconda Herrera is the president of the Latin American Studies Association and is also a professor at Flaxo, Ecuador, which is where I did my my Fulbright visit, and I kind of still think of as a home away from home academically, and am engaged in lots of projects together with them. And she has, I'm so honored to have her with us today. She's the leading scholar in the world on Ecuadorian immigration. Long before I wrote this book, I was reading her things, and so to be able to have some of her comments on the back cover of my book and to have her here today is such a privilege. So I'd like to turn it over to you if you don't mind, and let you talk some about your reaction to the book.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Jeff, for this invitation. It's really a great pleasure to be here and to celebrate the publication of the Invisibility Bargain. I want to begin by congratulating Jeffrey for this wonderful text, the product I know of many years. It's okay? Yeah, I thought you had problems hearing me. The problem, so I continue, I'm sorry. So it's a great pleasure to be here. I know that the book is the product of many years of being together with peace building people and processes among Colombian population fleeing from violence in their territories and communities, only to find on many occasions more violence in the localities where they try to build a new life. As we know, Colombians have been coming to Ecuador for 20 years now, and despite the peace process, in spite of more hostile migration policies, and in spite now of the pandemic, we know that many families keep crossing the northern border of Ecuador now, which is now formally closed because of the pandemic, but are still coming. So I want to thank Jeff for inviting me to comment on his books. I have seen him at various events in Ecuador. I've seen him going with his student in Flaxo during the summer schools on peace building. But I have approached his work, I guess, 4 years ago when I began to look at Venezuelan migration in Ecuador. And now it became clear to me that we need to look at very carefully at the Colombian experience in order to get the tools for a better understanding of what is going on right now in Ecuador with the arrival of this huge flow of Venezuelan migrants. This book is a comprehensive study of 15 years of policies toward Colombian migrants. And I think we really need to retrieve that in order to understand what is going on right now. I have to recognize that my own work over the last 20 years has focused on emigrations of Ecuadorians, first to Spain and then to the United States. And this kind of study is hardly related with the field of studies on immigrants. What the state has done, which is to create over the last 20 years, particularly through the constitutions and then through other policies, was an emphasis on Ecuadorian migrants and on his diaspora. And there was some interesting policies toward immigration, but the imbalance is really great between what was created for Ecuadorians abroad from what was applied for immigrants or refugees. And I think this academic works also mirror that kind of situation. And we have many more works about immigrants than about immigrants and refugees, despite being such an important case to understand Latin American immigrations. So I think that the first interesting contribution of Jeff's book is precisely to overcome this separation between these two literatures and these two kinds of immigration that are going on in Ecuador and in other countries of South America, and to build this bridge between these two phenomena, which I insist have been treated differently in Ecuador and in the rest of Latin America. So having said that, I would like to comment on three aspects, to highlight three aspects that I consider important contributions, both to migration studies, especially to South-South migration processes, which are still very scarce in the literature, especially, and more about Latin America. No? So these contributions, the three aspects I would like to highlight are the following. The first is something that I somewhat already said, which is the timely relevance of this study for understanding the current flow of Venezuelan migration in South America and states' response to this flow. The second contribution, I think, of Jeff's book is to the debate on mixed migration, on this concept that is now populating the narrative of international organization and some literatures on the field of migration. By looking in a different way, Jeff used the word of forced migration rather than mixed migration. And I would like to highlight that and to point out that this is important right now, that we are looking and discussing the kind of policies, the kind of of migration policies that should be put, that should be implemented in the case of Venezuelan migrants. And the third, more general contribution is to the discussion of South-South migration, as I said before. So let's start with the first round. As you know, I consider that looking at how the Ecuadorian state dealt with Colombian migration is a very useful background to understand what is going on now. What can we learn from this process? From the Colombian process is precisely what the book is about. And currently, we speak of around 400,000 Venezuelan migrants in Ecuador, about 1,900,000 in Colombia, and 800,000 in Peru. I want to remark that this is not, this is a South American process right now, and the responses of states has been initially an open response, an open border response, but has been progressively been closed. And of course, this is something aggravated by the pandemic. In in terms of responses and of policy, what we are looking right now, what we are experiencing, it's precisely an assemblage of states and non-state actors, much more than before, where the IOM, the UNHCR, and other, together with NGOs and the states, are trying to build this response. But it's still a very weak response, a response that is clearly focused on humanitarian emergency, on short-term, it is a short-term response. And again, this is even more, this is aggravated right now with the pandemic. The central concept of the book on the need to build human security based on the articulation of network governments, on the articulation of state, non-state actors, NGO, and the migrants, is what I think are the attempts right now to face Venezuelan migration. But there is a lot of tensions around this process that reading of Jeff's books of the 6 cases and their differences and the way power relations among these actors, private actors and non-state actors deploy could be very useful to understand the logic of the contemporary responses to migration, precisely because the book shows how show us the dynamics of these assemblages of these network governments in an institutional framework of political volatility towards forced migration. And when you have so many changes in migration policies, and when you are in a context of economic downturn, well, this is precisely what Jeffrey examines at the local level. And I think it's very similar to what is going on now, but in a much bigger volume. So Jeff's text allows us to understand that the way in which human security is built and the way in which people may access rights, may access labor and security is precisely through the actions of these states and non-state actors, coalitions, since invisibility and the Invisibility Bargain implies conditions of vulnerability and non-compliance with fundamental rights. And I would say invisibility right now is no longer possible. This is a strategy that it's hardly possible right now with such a huge and massive flow. So we definitely have to think about these other assemblages. The second contribution I would like to highlight is our understanding or our discussion on this idea of mixed flows. It is said that the motivations to migrate around the world are increasingly diverse, and that economic elements are intertwined with political issues or social violence, and therefore we need, to improve our conceptualization, and this idea of mixed flows appear. This category may serve to explain not only this blurring difference between economic and political motivations in the case of Colombian migration, but also of Haitian migration in South America in the last 10 years, and maybe, and the discussion is now around Venezuela. There's also debate, a strong debate on whether the Cartagena conventions should be applied precisely because it amplifies this, the conditions of who should be recognized as a refugee. But at times, the weak application of Cartagena Convention and its priority toward temporary visa policies to the detriment of the recognition of asylum has been shared in a certain way by this idea of mixed flows. Carmen Gomez, my colleague at FLACSO, argues that this happens in the case of Ecuador when the government stopped recognizing the Colombian populations as refugees and rather opt for this temporary Mercosur visa for a limited time, causing after 2 years the potential regularization of migrants. So I think that Jeff's books in this kind of discussion, when he speaks about forced migration and also amplifies and about migrants and not only refugees or economic migrants, shows the need to overcome these bureaucratic categories and reflect on the social and political needs that must be met by states from a different perspective. Because the use of other categories such as mixed flows, which is now more and more in the narrative of some studies and of international organizations, may rather hide the forced nature of this migration. There is now a current and other scholars looking at this, the work of Feline Freyer, Costa, and Cécile Blouin support the need to apply Cartagena, for example, to the Venezuelan case. And in our work in progress with my colleague Carmen Gomez, we are working precisely on the need to understand Colombian, Haitian, and Venezuelan cases are different gradations of a quite similar phenomenon, which is something that also I think Jeff's book implies when he treats the Colombian case not as the exception of the uniqueness, but rather as a migration process. Because most of the time, at least in South America, Colombian refugees or Colombian forced migration was like, this is so different from border migration in other parts of South America, or this is so different of South-North migration, of this is so different of other immigration flows. I think that by the kind of concept, the kind of issue, by looking at practices, assemblages, and the way people deal with the constructions of more secure environments, this is something that other groups in Ecuador have tried to do. Haitian migration and now Venezuelan migration are facing. So I think that this is also part of this discussion on forced migration, which not only apply right now, I would say, to Colombians, but to other groups in South America. And finally, the third contribution I would like to highlight is the understanding of the specificities of South-South migration and how these different 6 cases that Jeff looked at in his book show the importance of policies and projects and solutions that take into account the relationship between migrants and local population, and how to approach the relationship with local population when when poverty and when scarcity is shared, and what are the kind of tensions of otherness that arise from people that share these same situations, and how to fight in that kind of context, the growing xenophobia that is emerging in many of these contexts. So this is part of what does it mean to get out of from a crisis context and to find another crisis when you after in destination countries. No, again, as I said, the experience of the 6 localities of that the book exhaustively examines shows the importance and the need to construct policies that serve both the migrant population and the local population. And these types of actions are maybe the most successful in looking at social integration at this time. 2 examples came to my mind when I was looking at Jeff's books. One is the project of a small institution in the city of Ibarra, which is granting credits for women, for Colombian, Venezuelan, and Ecuadorian women at the same time, looking precisely on how to build and how to lessen the kind of tensions that are growing right now. And another example is something that a student of mine has found in the southern border of Ecuador. And she mentioned to me, she mentions that in order to obtain that an NGO, in order to obtain the authorization for the construction of a shelter, of a migrant shelter from the local government, they built a sewer system in the small city of Huaquilla. That this was the condition in order to build the shelter. This type of collaboration between migrant and non-migrant population, of this type of conditions put by local governments in that second case, are fundamental to or indicate a very different dynamic within South-South migrations, and contrast with the way in which states alone frequently act when they rather try to avoid and to hide their assistance and protections policies to avoid a xenophobic pronouncement. Once again, an example of this different type of policy is what happened right now during the pandemic in Ecuador, when the few social protection measures given to the populations to mitigate the effects of COVID explicitly excluded migrants because of the threat of the idea that xenophobic reaction. And this is something that, of course, contradicts our progressive constitutional constitution. Again, the examination of these assemblages of network governance constitutes an important way to understand these dynamics in context of scarcity that differ from the forms of exclusion or integration of South-North migration, and which is something that has been much more studied and that we tend to reproduce when we look at these different dynamics of South-South migrations. In sum, I want to congratulate Jeff to celebrate the publication of this book that will certainly engage fruitful debates and conversations about the character of these new migratory flows in Ecuador and South America, and the formation of, who knows, different governance, network of governance that will help us to understand how not only the state, but these different networks of state and non-state actors are building safe and secure environments, or rather favoring private interests and reinforcing xenophobic sentiments in society. So I think this instrument, this concept, not only show us cooperation and the possibility of getting more secure environment, but also will help us to look at how the tensions and the problems of the way in which these kind of policies are being applied. I really hope that we can get a translation into Spanish of the book soon, so that our students, researchers, local official activists all over South America could benefit from the concepts, ideas, and research of the Invisibility Bargain. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Herrera. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Let me suggest that students and colleagues, faculty colleagues, and community members, 60 some of you on here, it would be great if you want to put a few questions into the chat. Stephen and I will monitor the chat, and if you can get a few questions in, and while you're getting questions in, please do it. I'll start with one question for Jeff to talk to us a little bit. So Jeff, you can take a couple of minutes to respond, of course, to Professor Herrera. And then one of the things that really struck me about some of your work and some of the things that you get at when you think about networked governance is that these migrants and refugees and people in local communities have kind of illustrated in your work an amazing organizational capacity. They're organizing NGOs and networks and community sort of support systems in some very dire circumstances. So I wondered if you just talk a little bit about the sort of capacity of these community supporting connections and organizations. Also, as you respond to Professor Herrera's wonderful comments. And please, other folks, chime in with some questions in the chat, and we'll come back.
Thanks so much, Stacy. And I've already gotten a few in the individual chat, so I think in a moment I'll recognize those people and see if they want to say them out loud, and if not, I'll read them out loud. But first, thank you, Professor Herrera, for your comments and for your support throughout all of this. Very insightful, and you're absolutely right that I see this as a deep dive into one population story, the Colombians in Ecuador, but I've always approached this as a comparativist, as a person interested in developing something that could be helpful elsewhere. And I think that's how most people receive it. That certainly, as you point out, the big story right now is the Venezuelan flow in the region, which is on task to be one of the biggest displacements in the world. It certainly is already the biggest displacement in the Americas. And so almost learning from what came before is important, right? So doing a deep dive into what happened with Colombians, I think offers us some lessons and a point of comparison for Venezuelans. Venezuelans and Colombians are not the same. Actually, with my colleague Luis Jimenez and one of our Simproc interns, Bettina Latouf, we recently published an article specifically based on a comparative survey and comparing the experience of Venezuelans and Colombians in Quito. And the takeaway message is Colombians are having a harder time in their own minds, partly because they've been there longer and therefore I think had longer time to experience discrimination, be the victim of crime, etc., have lower trust in the government. But I think also because all of the attention is on the Venezuelan flow, and yet despite the promise of the peace agreement, Colombians can't go home, right? It's still not safe. They've become an invisibilized population where their needs aren't really being prioritized in the same way. So that's one strain of future research, is to develop those comparisons. We already have a survey that's been fielded and have done one thing, but a lot more to do on comparisons with the Haitians, Venezuelans, actually, and Chinese. We included the Chinese in Quito as another population. One of the questions, and I think Josie left already, Josie Patterson. She was asking about sort of how this could relate to the US and the relevance to the United States. And my hunch is quite a lot. And with a colleague, a former colleague from Providence College, we're actually right now working on a survey and experiment to test in a bit more rigorous empirical and systematic detail how the invisibility bargain can work in a new context, the United States and its perceptions of immigrants, and also sort of how psychological predispositions, ideology, and things like that intersect with these broad brush expectations within the host society. So does the invisibility bargain sort of activate a stronger response for high authoritarian or high social dominant types of people, or for one ideology more than the other? Does contact and meaningful interaction mitigate that conflict? And does it do it for some people more than others? So we're certainly looking into that. We can see in the headlines, certainly over the past 4 years, and still, the way that these expectations lay out. And I think of the example of Representative Ilhan Omar from Minnesota, who is, a Somali, was a Somali refugee, and wears a hijab, and yet she has ascended to the Congress of the United States. And some people within the host community saw that as violating the political invisibility bargain. And in fact, Trump himself, as well as other hangers-on like Tucker Carlson and folks like that, sort of use very similar rhetoric to what we see described here. We rescued her from this country, and she isn't even grateful. She sort of thinks that she has to badmouth the US, and how dare she, is sort of the underlying implication because of this perceived violation of the invisibility bargain. And there were death threats as a result of that. So the kind of harmful impact of that backlash is not to be underestimated. So I wanted to lay that all out. Magali, are you still here? You had a question as well. Magali Sanchez.
Yeah, I'm here, Jeff. Congratulations.
Would you like to ask your question?
Let me remember. Yes, I was I was asking if in the I didn't read the book yet, but if you in the research you are also considering no-state actors that would be armed actors and criminal actors that are in a way or another basically taking advantage of massive migration at the moment. And basically because massive migrations is gonna be, that's my opinion, my humble opinion, it will be huge if authoritarian regime continue to expand the way that they are. The criminal economy are based in not actors, no state actors. So that was my question, and I stopped there. Otherwise, I never ending. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that important question. And it's one that I have grappled with some, and I always feel like I want to give a caveat that although I founded a peace studies center and am from the NGO world, I don't want my book to give the impression that NGOs are the saviors, are always better than the state. That's not the takeaway message. In fact, there are lots of kinds of non-state actors. There are the FARC themselves. There are the paramilitaries. One of the things that happened is there are people from those armed groups who will be present in spaces within Ecuador, be watching what happens, and people have been killed in Ecuador even because of non-state actors having a sort of intelligence capacity. There is also the case that as the state moves towards a more restrictive clampdown on the movement of bodies. As Hilkonda mentioned, the closing of borders with the pandemic, and even before that with the large flows of Venezuelans, it's not that the migrants just disappear, right? They then go to their governance network for access to rights, resources, and protection. And sometimes that's illicit actors, right? They go to loan sharks to get money. They go to what they call guides, who are really sort of people who help them find informal trochas or crossings that are illegal and get them across. There are goods that come across at the same time as bodies. So there's a whole political economy that is illicit and that is actually strengthened. These non-state actors are strengthened when the state feels that it needs a sort of performative expression of state power to close down and restrict migration flows. So it becomes a sort of negotiation, sometimes competition, sometimes a tacit cooperation between state and non-state actors, both licit and illicit. Although my story often sort of focuses even more on the potential promise, it's important to think about how governance happens with a group that has a violence capacity and interest. And for that, I would highly recommend the book of Annette Idler, who is at Oxford University. Her book, Borderland Battles, looks exactly at that. And she develops the concept of shadowland citizenship or shadow citizenship to describe these connections between illicit and violent actors in the borders between Colombia and Ecuador and Colombia and Venezuela.
Professor Adozi has her hand up for a question.
Go for it.
Thank you. Congratulations, Jeff. Great effort. Fantastic press. I haven't read the book yet, but I'm going to get my hands on it. My question, though, wants you to maybe problematize your theoretical construct a little bit. Is the invisibility compact, sacrosanct, right? To what extent, does it, change, reform, revise? One of the greatest examples of, Ecuadorian, an Ecuadorian refugee or political asylum, contender was Julian Assange. It came to the world where, the Correa regime, state regime, granted Assange asylum, in the UK, for 3 years. I mean, just fascinating case. And this was a state regime doing that. Of course, there might have been political reasons, why the state was doing that, but still, when do states, when are they, good actors, in support of, refugees and, migrants? I think there's a comparison between, Biden and Trump's, their regime responses to, our state regime responses to this phenomenon. And so I'm just wondering whether or not you can give us a little bit more of a, complicated picture, both theoretically and empirically, whether your book does that. Thank you.
Definitely, thanks. It does some. I would, one area where it does delve in is some of the factors that can mitigate the negative impact of the invisibility backlash. And those of us in the conflict resolution field are familiar with the idea of contact theory, that when you have meaningful, frequent interaction with someone from another group, it helps prevent the dehumanization of that other group, right? It's harder to say, well, all migrants are bad and they should all go back home when, hey, my best buddy that I play soccer with is a migrant as well, right? That complicates and nuances our views and individualizes it. It may still be that I say, well, he's the good one, everyone else is a jerk, but it still makes it harder to have those stereotypes. And so the evidence that I was finding was quite persuasive that I actually asked a couple of questions about this on my survey of the Colombians, of the migrants. And I asked them what their general perception was of Ecuadorians, and also how frequently they interacted with Ecuadorians and in what context, like on the street or the market, superficial contact like that, or in the family, workplace, neighborhood, etc. And it was just very persuasive evidence that those who had no contact tended to have pretty negative perceptions of the other group. Almost nobody had a positive view of Ecuadorians who was in that boat. And of those who had meaningful, frequent interaction, more than half had a positive perception of the other group, and only, a much smaller number had a negative perception. What was interesting is those who had casual, superficial contact. In that case, the thing that went down was those who said no opinion. Basically, whatever they already believed was locked in even more. So it had higher numbers who had positive and higher numbers who had negative. And so to some extent, one of the big findings here is that one of the best survival strategies that migrants can have is to leverage connections, build relationships, and that not only helps the other group and them have better peace, right? Better perceptions of each other. It has very concrete things. They find out about jobs through those networks that they wouldn't find out just from hearing from their own compatriots. So those are things that can mitigate the harm of the invisibility backlash, and relationships are things that don't necessarily spark a xenophobic backlash from visibility. The paradox or the tragedy here is that that's exactly what people tend not to do, because they're afraid of this backlash against social visibility. You heard the empanada lady. I want to stay home and keep my mouth shut. So how do you build relationships when that's the pressure? So people are less likely to do it, but those who do will have better outcomes. So I think I'll leave that there. There were a couple of student questions in the chat, and I want to be sure to mention, let me just read out two of them, and then we'll go back to the thing. So Selena Ocampo, who is a student at La Universidad San Francisco de Quito, asked what were the hardest factors of my investigation. Oh, you're here. You want to ask it? Go ahead.
Yes, I just want to ask you, like, what were the most difficult factors of your investigation here? Because, I mean, I am well aware that sometimes government does not collaborate with investigators, and sometimes certain factors or certain numbers, like, for example, they don't give it to you easily. Or maybe do you find like a lack of academia papers here about this topic, and just how was your process here?
Thank you. Yes, governments aren't always eager to share everything about what they're doing and how it is having harmful things. And the concrete example of here, this is a group of very influential people. So we'll see if I get in trouble, but it's in the book. So if I get in trouble, it already will. During this period of research, I brought my study abroad students to various parts of Ecuador, and we would often have briefings, meetings with the UNHCR and with people from the Cancilleria, which is the foreign ministry. Every time we would have those meetings, the first time I asked the person, so can you tell us how many people are claiming asylum in Ecuador? And they would tell us this number of people. Okay, well, what percentage of that number have been granted asylum? And they started getting they hemmed and hawed and gave, the first year they gave the answer of how many were admissible and acted as though that were the answer to my question. But that just meant how many were deemed good enough to enter the process of asylum, not those who were granted it. And the second year, I was very clear. I did not mean admissibility. I meant what's the percentage that got it. And he didn't give a straight answer. So the third year, I got a student to ask, prepped them ahead of time and asked if they would ask. So 4 or 5 years, finally I heard through the word that it was actual policy not to make this public. The website had not been updated in about 6 years at that point for the asylum numbers. And so that spiky graph I showed you in the slideshow, I couldn't do that for almost the whole time I was working on this book, because the numbers were not public about the fact that they were basically approving less than 5% of the asylum claims. They had a narrative of open citizenship, but were hollowing out its meaning in practice and didn't want people to know that. And so it was really only with the change of regime after Correa was out of power and Lenin Moreno was in, that finally they published the statistics, and that's there. So that's an example of persistence and being in it for the long haul, writing a 15-year book. You eventually get some answers, even when the government doesn't want to cooperate.
Jeff, I'm mindful of the time, so I see 2 hands. I would suggest you take both Eben and Isabel's questions, and so that we make sure that everybody gets a chance.
Good idea. Isabel, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I was thinking about like how could we like do a new immigration reform, because it has because when we was in class with my group, we was one of the students mentioned that like it's been a long time, and I feel like what could we do as a conference resolution to pressure them to do the reform over?
Yeah, that's a tricky question, precisely because of this logic of the invisibility bargain. Because in 2006, in May, the United States had a massive countrywide protest, right? Mexican immigrants and others went out into the streets and said, enough, we need comprehensive immigration reform. We must have it now. And it was also in response to a really horrific law that was being proposed. And so it had a proximate cause, but a broader thing. And it did have some success, certainly in waking people up to the fact that this was a political constituency. It helped build some bridges that hadn't been there before. But in Chris Zapeta-Millán's wonderful book, Mobilizing Latino Mass Mobilization is the name of it. He lays out that one of the impacts was a rise in hate crimes. People were aware that there was a reaction against all of these Mexicans out in the street protesting, and they didn't get comprehensive immigration reform. The McCain deal didn't work. It fell apart. There wasn't enough support. And the fact that people sort of were taken aback by the power of the movement, to some extent, made it harder to get that change. And so I think that's where we have to look at other kinds of strategies. Certainly, political advocacy is a big one, especially by allies and coalitions that include migrants speaking for themselves. Dreamers, for example, as a sympathetic face to the migrant movement, and also bringing in allies with shared interests and political clout, like labor unions. So I think that's a big part of it. But it's going to be hard, because the more visible and the more momentum that movement has, the more headwinds it's going to face from people who fear it. Eben.
Hey, Jeff. Well, listen, as others have said, congratulations. It's so great to see this piece of work finally out in book form. It's been exciting work all along, and it's really great to see it where it's gotten to. So that's really terrific. As you were going through the presentation and you started talking about some of the impact of contact, I was thinking, obviously it caught my attention, and I was thinking about, this just the last couple of weeks, a Journal of Social Issues dropped devoted entirely to contact theory, and where that work has been extended and where it stands now. So, very timely. And you started talking about this a little bit in response to Kiki's question. And I was wondering about a couple of things. One is whether the various findings you talked about suggest any modifications or extensions of theory around contact stuff. And the other is that as you were talking about sort of implications for practice and for intervention, you were talking about the dilemma of, potentially a positive strategy for immigrants is to have more contact in the appropriate kinds of ways, but that there's a real dilemma there right? Because of all the ways in which they are silenced and pushed aside, and in which it's risky to reach out for that. It got me wondering about larger scale interventions at the policy level, at the level of, local groups trying to make changes. I wonder what kinds of thoughts you've had about those possibilities.
Yeah. So there were several bits in there. One was about the sort of theoretical extension of contact theory. And I would say in the book, I'm more confirming it and showing that it does in fact work here. And it helps to mitigate the negative effects of the sort of social invisibility expectation. In the new project that I mentioned that I'm doing with my colleague Matt Guardino, we are hoping to move that forward in new directions, and especially by looking at the ways that psychological predispositions and ideology can magnify or mitigate these political invisibility expectations. We're going to include an experiment where people will see a protest, and the manipulations are what kind of protest and who's doing it. So in some of the treatments, it'll be the same protesters, but in some cases they'll have signs in Spanish. In some cases, they'll have signs in Arabic. In other cases, they'll have signs in Arabic and a few women in hijabs. And so we're trying to tease out what kinds of social visibility activate these backlashes more than others. The preliminary data that we have suggests that in the United States context, religion is now the one that seems to motivate people most. There was a famous article a number of years ago that claimed that language, Spanish is for the US and Islam is for Europe. But after 9/11, I think that has shifted. And so our evidence so far seems to indicate that religion is the mobilizing factor and that contact helps to mitigate that, right? It makes it less severe. So we're going to try to nuance it in that way. And then in terms of the policy stuff, I think some of it actually has to do with changing narratives. And a project I'm working on with a former grad student is looking at that, how media discourses pave the way for different ways of looking at immigrants, of understanding them, of knowing what they're about and how to react to them. And so investing in influencers shaping the narrative can go a long way towards a more productive and constructive conversation. And I guess I'll just mention one more that ties that back to Kiki's thing about how the sort of global influences might impact when is a president or a policy leader likely to favor or not progressive approaches. With our doctoral student Uluç, who's on the call here, we're currently working on a comparative project comparing Correa in Ecuador with Erdogan in Turkey as both populist leaders who are mobilizing relatively progressive and welcoming discourses about migration, and then it sort of declines over time, and figuring out what does that tell us about the political incentives that they respond to. Some of it inherently about populism and some just about leaders in general.
Jeff, that's fantastic. I was going to say, I'm really interested in how there are parallels here in your discussion of Invisibility Bargain to sort of 40 years of gay, lesbian, and transgender activism. It's absolutely clear in the record in many countries that increasing visibility and coming out increased political backlash and exposed a lot of people to violence. And our conservative colleagues in this country are about running around the country trying to pass anti-transgender state laws right now because it's good for them politically, right? Because such Americans are more visible and therefore they are coming under a political attack. So I think, the kind of dynamics are really, really interesting here to think about how what you have. I love this term, but I think it's really great to think about how it connects to, broadly speaking, to the history of activism and social change, and what demands and what are the risks of demanding justice. So really just amazing stuff. I will thank Kelly and Lee for all of their organization. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I will thank Stephen for keeping us on track. And I will turn it over to Jeff to close. And if I had music, I would play you off like the Oscars, but you're welcome to end us up.
Well, thank you, Stacy, for hosting and moderating. And as you said, the folks who make all of this happen are Kelly and Lee. And so thank you all for the organizational work behind the scenes, and to Steve as well. It has been such a wonderful conversation today. Thank you for coming and joining me with this. And I hope that you find the book helpful in understanding the sort of complexities of migrant interaction. And I've put in the chat my contact information. You can find more about the book at invisibilitybargain.com. And then my email is there in the chat. So for those who we didn't have time to get to your question, feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to schedule a time and chat your ear off, probably, since I'm so excited about this topic. So have a wonderful rest of the week, everyone, and thanks for joining.
If you want to